So now we're up to the first Mishnah as we begin the seventh parak on Peites Amid Beis, the parak of Gid Anosha. Now we have to understand one thing as we introduce this parak. The Gid Anosha really, there are two sinews in the animal. One is called the Gid HaPnimi, the inner sinew, and the other is called the Gid HaChitzoni, the outer sinew. As far as the inner sinew is concerned, which branches out from the rear of the spinal column and runs down the animal's thigh, so that is Asur Midrabbanan. The real Isur Doraisa of Gid Anosha applies to the Gid HaChitzon, to the Gid HaPnimi, which is the inner sinew, whereas the outer sinew runs across the thigh. And the Torah Doraisa Isur of Gid Anosha applies to the Pnimi and not to the Chitzoni. The Chitzoni is only Asur Midrabbanan. Now, exactly what this Gid HaChitzoni is a long historic machlokes between the Ashkenazim and the Teimonim, believe it or not. And the Gid HaChitzon, which is only also D'Rabbanan, according to the Ashkenazim, is called the femoral nerve. And it really doesn't go all the way down. It starts from what's called the Kaf HaYerech, because that Kaf HaYerech defines Gid Anosha. If you don't have Kaf HaYerech, like for example in birds, there's no such thing as a Kaf HaYerech, a round spoon of the thigh. But anyway, the Gid Anosha goes down from the Kaf HaYerech, and there are two different what's called sinews, each of which, according to a particular tradition, whether it's Ashkenaz or Teiman, is that which the Rabbanan prohibited as the Gid HaChitzon. The Gid HaChitzon, or the minhag of Teimanim, actually goes all the way down, down, down to the bottom of the leg of the animal. Okay, let's begin the parak. We'll probably have to come back to this over and over again, but Gid Anosha noig ba'aretz u'b'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayis shelo b'fnei habayis b'chulin u'v'mukdosh. Right, so this is a structure of the Mishnah that we've had over and over again with regard to Osov Espino, with regard to Kisei Adam, that, you know what, even though Gid Anosha applies to Mukdoshim, nevertheless, it's not limited to the time period in which there's a bias or to the location which is called a hara bias. And it applies even in chutz la'aretz. However, noig bebehema ubechaya, but it doesn't apply to an oaf. And why is that? Because the Torah says that the Gid Anosha is in the Kaf Yerech, the Yorech shel Yamin, Yorech shel Smol, both on the right side, the right thigh and the left thigh, but Einu noig be oaf, if they she'ein lo kaf. The oaf doesn't have a spoon-shaped flesh on its thigh. Now the Mishnah introduces a machlokes, which is going to be the subject of today's daf, and that is the shlil. If you have a fetus, is there an Isur Gid Anosha to the fetus? The Tanakama says v'noeg b'shlil. Apparently, the Tanakama views the shlil, the fetus, as a separate entity. It's not part of the mother. It's not like a limb in the mother's body, but rather an entity unto itself. And Rashi points out that we're talking about a fetus that is 9 months old, meaning it reached full term. We slaughtered the mother, and then we found in the womb of the mother this full term 9-month fetus. And Rabbi Meir, as we'll see later on Daf Tzadi Beis, is of the opinion that this full-term fetus requires its own shechita because it's a separate entity. We don't view it as part of the mother. It's independent of the mother. And as an independent animal, there's an Isur Gid Anosha. But we have to emphasize, says Rashi, that all this applies only if the fetus is full term. If it's not full term, then it's part of the mother. But we'll soon see that there's a drasha that teaches you that anything that's part of the mother is not prohibited. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, Eino noeg where am I? Eino noeg b'shlil. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that the shlil is part of its mother. And even though it's a live, full-term fetus, the shechita of the mother is matir the fetus. And when the fetus is born, it's called a ben pekua, as we discussed. But we don't view the fetus as an independent animal. And therefore, the Gid Anosha is included in that drasha that I intimated, which is called Ba Behema Tochelu. That's anything in the animal you're allowed to eat, including its Gid Anosha. Then Rabbi Yehuda goes on to tell us that Chelbo Mutter, since we have our loch of Kol Ba Behema Tochelu, therefore the chelev of the full-term fetus is permitted. So we have two halachas that both derive from the same basic source, logical source, and they're both Rabbi Yehuda, that the Gid Anosha, this live full-term fetus, is not independent of the mother, and therefore the chelev and the Gid Anosha are mutter. But Rabbi Meir again, which is the Chachamim here in our Mishnah, views the fetus as an independent animal. The shechita of the mother would not be meaningful for the fetus. And as an independent animal, its Gid Anosha and its chelev are forbidden. Now the Mishnah goes on to another machlokas. Do we believe the butcher when he says that he did shroimen, meaning he removed the Gid Anosha? And according to Tanakama, which is Rabbi Meir, Ein hatabochim ne'monim al Gid Anosha. Gid Anosha is a tircha gedola to remove the Gid Anosha. Very, very complicated. And therefore we don't trust the butchers. We're going to need some independent evidence that the Gid Anosha was removed. However, Chachamim omer ne'monim alav v'al hachelev. We believe the butcher when he says that he removed the Gid Anosha and he removed the chelev. Okay, now we get to the Gemara. All right. Now the Gemara that we're about to learn revolves around two different issues that sort of overlap. And they are the following. Number one is Yesh begidim beno Saint Tam or ein begidim beno Saint Tam. And number two is ein iser chalal iser. Now, the first issue of whether Gidin is beno Saint Tam will be relevant to the following case. Let's say you took the yerech, the thigh of the animal after shechita, and you cooked it without removing the giranosha. Does the entire thigh become prohibited because it absorbed the taste of the giranosha? Or should we say no? Giranosha is like eitz bialma. It's like a piece of wood. It doesn't have any taste. It's a sinew, and therefore it doesn't generate any tam isur in the basar of the thigh. So now we're going to start the sugya, and the Mishnah told us that giranosha applies to mukdashim. What did you discover, America? I mean, why would we think otherwise? Just because you magdish an animal, it removes the iser giranosha, it goes up to Shemayim? The Gemara asks, mukdashim pshita. Mishum de, in a facetious way, the Gemara says, Mishum de akdishe pakala iser gid mine. Somehow, you said, I raise that hegdesh, shlomim. Therefore, now the iser giranosha dissipates into thin air. B'chi tema, and if you'll tell me, yesh begidim beno Saint Tam. Okay, now we get to the second major dimension of this sugya, and that's Eini Sechalisa. Now, let's assume that yesh begidim beno Saint Tam. We're going to try to prove that our Mishnah cannot possibly maintain that yesh begidim beno. But right now, the Gemara is throwing out the possibility that Gidin, the Giranosha, has Nesinas Tam. Now, there's an Iser Hano from Mukdashim. You're not allowed to benefit from Mukdashim. So therefore, if you were to eat the Giranosha of a Behemas Shlomim Lamazagin, then not only do you violate Giranosha, but you also violate the Iser Hano in benefiting from the Tam, if there is Tam, of the Giranosha. Now the question is, which Iser of these two Isurim took effect first? It's Kol HaKodim Zocha. The Asi Isur Mikdashim, the Chayil A Isur Gid. So we're going to learn a Chiddush in our Mishnah. And that Chiddush is that if you eat the Giranosha of a Behemoth Shlomim, for example, then you get two sets of malchus. You violated two different Isur. You violated the Isur of Achilas Giranosha, and you violated the Isur Hana of Mukdash. Again, we're going to have to see how that works out, because L'chora, the Isur Giranosha was Chal already first, and therefore the Isur Mukdashim, after you were Magdish, it cannot be Chal later, and ain't Isur Chal Lisa. But wait, hold off on that. So Gemara rejects this. Why? Hai Mukdashim noig begid mi boile. Let's read the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say that the Isur Mukdashim applies to Giranosha. The Mishnah says just the opposite, that the Isur Giranosha applies to Mukdashim. Ella, but rather, let's go back and start from scratch. Because Savar, our Mishnah holds, ain't beginning in Saint Tam. So therefore, if you eat the gid of Mukdashim, you're not in violation of the Isra Hano from Mukdashim, because you don't get any Hano, there's no Tam. Mukdashim, therefore, Isra Gid Ika Isur Mukdashim Leka. Right? The Torah says whether it has tam or it doesn't, don't eat the Gid Anasha. So you're definitely in violation of Isur Gid Anasha. Did you also violate the Isur Anah and benefit from the Gid Anasha because it's Mukdashim? And if it's Mukdashim, you're not allowed to benefit from it? No, the answer is Ein Beginning B'no Saint Tam. So, now, at this point in the Gemara, we're going to have to read the Mishnah a little bit differently. The Mishnah is saying that Gid Anasha applies to Mukdashim, but only Gid Anasha applies to Mukdashim. And the Isur of Hanah for Mukdashim does not apply. That's how we're reading the Mishnah now. The Gemara rejects it. V'savar Tana Didana Ein Beginim B'no Saint Tam. There's a later Mishnah. We're assuming the later Mishnah follows our Mishnah with one Shita, and that holds that Ein Beginim B'no Saint Tam. I'm sorry, that Yesh Beginim B'no Saint Tam. But Tanan, Yerech shenis bashel ba Gid Anasha im yesh ba b'no Saint Tam harei zu asura. If you eat any part of the Yerech after it was cooked together with the Gid Anasha, you violate the Isur Gid Anasha if there's a tam of the Gid Anasha in the Yerech. Meaning it's more than a ratio of 1 to 60. Let's say it's 2 to 60. In any event, you see that clearly our Mishnah holds that Yesh Beginim B'no Saint Tam. Therefore, we need bittul the tam of the Gid Anasha in the Yerech. So don't tell me that our Mishnah holds Ein Beginim B'no Saint Tam, and it's telling me that you're not chayiv for Mukdashim, you're only chayiv for Gid Anasha because there's no tam and you didn't get any benefit in the Yanah from Mukdashim. So now the Gemara goes back to its original understanding of our Mishnah, that the Mishnah is telling me that even in Mukdashim, there's an Isur Gid Anasha, which again, we said ridiculous. So who would think otherwise? I mean, just because you're Magdash it, you remove the Isur Gid Anasha. So why do you have to tell me a Chiddush that there's Gid Anasha in Mukdashim? Unless we're talking about the fetus. And if you remember, there was a great controversy about the fetus. Elahocha bevlados kodshim askina. We're talking about the fetus of a behemas shlom. Vikas savar. Okay, now we have a whole string of assumptions here in our Mishnah. Number one, the Mishnah is holding that noeg b'shlil, that there is Gid Anasha in the fetus, which is the Shita of Rabbi Meir, that the fetus is viewed as an independent animal and not part of the mother and not included in Kol B'Behema Tochelu. That's number one. Number two, because Savar, Vlados Kodshim Imahem Kedoshim. A Vlad, a future birth of a fetus. It's not yet ready to be born. It's only at the beginning of its formulation. And it's called the Vlad of Kodshim, and it's already Kadosh. And now, if we put together A plus B, and we add to boot the principle of Ein Isur Chalal Isur, then there's no Isur Gid Anasha here. Not because there's no Gid Anasha in a shlil. There is Gid Anasha in a shlil. But the problem is that it's Vlad Kodshim, and the Isur Kodshim already emerged immediately as the fetus is beginning to form. So if not for our Mishnah, you might say that the Isur of Gid Anasha would not be Chal because the Gid from the moment of the formation, even before the birth, is already asumi din mukadash and any suchalisa. But no, the Mishnah says Yechayev also for Giranasha. Why? The Isur Giranasha, the Isur Mukdash Bari Adodi Asu. When do we say an Isur Chal Isur? That's when Isur number one is Chal first, and then you want to superimpose at some later point what emerges as Isur number two. No. Only Isur number one is Chal. But if both Isurim are Chal B'vasacha simultaneously, and the Giranasha together with the Isur Anov Mukdashim are both Chal simultaneously because they're both Chal with the formulation. I shouldn't say formulation. I think it's called formation. That makes more sense, I think. With the formation of the Vlad in its mother's womb, we don't apply the principle of Isur Chal Isur, and therefore you're going to violate two Isurim here, both Mukdashim and Giranasha. So now we have a little bit of a technical objection, which the Gemara is going to reject. The Gemara says, "Mi motzis mukmas le b'shlil." How can you tell me the Mishnah is actually talking about a fetus? V'amidik tani sefer. The latter part of the Mishnah records the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda regarding the status of a fetus, whether there is Giranasha or not. And midas tani sefer noig b'shlil is michal dereisha la b'shil askina. Right? There's no indication at all that the Mishnah from the start, from the get-go, when it establishes that Giranasha is noeg b'chulin u'b'mukdashin is talking about a fetus. It's not talking about a fetus. We're going to get to fetus later. The Gemara says, "Hochi, that's not a problem." Davar zeh machlokes Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, that subject matter, namely a fetus, which we were discussing already in the Reisha to tell you that in the case of a fetus of mukdashim, you're going to be chayav for both, not just for mukdashim, but also for Giranasha. That subject, or premise of the Reisha, namely that there is Giranasha in a shlil, that itself is a subject to a great prejudice. Now, now we get into a very complicated part of the Gemara, and we sort of enter into the world of Taros. And the Gemara now is going to take an excursion into the world of Taros with a Mishnah in Maseches Nazir of all places, because a Nazir, if he comes in contact with a dead corpse, then he has to shave his head. That's called Tiglachas Nazir al Kizayis Min Ames. And from this analysis they're about to embark upon of Tiglachas of a Nazir who contaminated himself to a mess, which is a subject of a Mishnah in Nazir, we're going to arrive at a conclusion that the Isur Mukdashim actually comes or emerges before the Isur Giranasha, which completely undermines our explanation of our Mishnah, which assumed that both Isurim are Chal v'Vasachas. V'atnan al elu tumos hanozim megaleach. If a Nazir came in contact with a corpse, when is it considered a tumah that generates tiglachas? And the Mishnah has what we considered a superfluous phrase, which the Gemara is going to analyze now. It says al ames, meaning he came in contact with a human corpse. The al kazayis min ames, and even if he came in contact with a part of the corpse that has the volume of a kazayis, he needs tiglachas. So why did the Mishnah in Nazir has to mention al ames? A mess is a full corpse. If you're telling me that all we need for tiglachas is that he came in contact with a kazayis min ames, then what do you have to tell me if he came in contact with a full corpse? Kasha kazayis min ames megalech al kulo lo kolshke. Rabbi Yochanan lo nitzchel lenefel shelo niksheru evarav begidin. This is not a regular run-of-the-mill case of a corpse, but this is a case of a fetus that was aborted in its very early stages of formation. And what is this stage, as Rabbi Yochanan describes it? Shelo niksheru evarav begidin. So the evarim are the limbs, the gidin are the sinews, and even though we don't have a kezayis min hames, and we have an aborted fetus whose limbs were not yet bound together by sinews, but we nevertheless have a complete fetus. If the limbs had already been formed, Rashi says, no, again, the limbs are not yet bound by the sinews. So we're in a stage where the limbs were formed, but the sinews were not formed. All right. I mean, again, we have to know a lot of olos here, but just accept on principle that if it was after the sinews were formed, then there's no requirement of kizayis min hames. But if we're talking about an early stage in pregnancy, where although the limbs had formed, but the but the sinews have not formed, then lechora you would have said you need a kizayis min hames, and yet this aborted fetus in its early stage of pregnancy doesn't have a kizayis of flesh. But nevertheless, the Mishnah in Nazir is establishing that since you have a complete corpse, meaning a complete fetus, therefore, in this case, even though the sinews have not yet formed, nevertheless, it's considered a complete corpse, and the Nazir, when he comes in contact, would now be required to undergo tiglachas. Alma, says the Gemara here on top of Daf Tzadi, and with this we're going to complete the Iser Mukdashim Kodem, meaning if the sinews haven't formed yet, then there's no Gid Anosha. And yet the corpse of this fetus that has limbs but doesn't have any sinews in its early aborted stage has the status of a corpse. I'm just missing one piece of the puzzle here, which I got stuck with this morning. If it has the status of the corpse, therefore, ipso facto, the Isur Mukedoshim will be chal. He says here that as far as Mukdoshim is concerned, the fetus becomes Hegdesh with Kedushas Haguf from the moment it forms. The fetus forms. And yet the sinews haven't yet developed. So there's no Gid Anosha. And therefore, when the Gid Anosha would be Chal, it's already Aser B'Toras Mukdoshim. And therefore, the Gemara objects now to that interpretation that the Iser Mukdoshim and the Iser of Gid Anosha are Chal simultaneously. Because since you're talking about a fetus, in the case of the fetus, even though the sinews have not yet developed, as long as you have the limbs, it's already considered Kodesh. And yet there's no Gid Anosha because there are no sinews. So therefore the Iser Kodshim will be Chal before the Iser of Gid Anosha, and therefore wouldn't be also B'Toras Gid Anosha. How could our Mishnah therefore say that it's Asur Midin Gid Anosha? So before we end, I just want to say this. We have entered into the sugya of Ein Iser Chal Iser, and we've been working with a naive assumption that once the first Iser takes hold, the second Iser cannot be added to be Chal. There's no piggybacking one Iser on top of the other. That assumption is naive. And I'll tell you why. Because there's something called an Iser Mosif. Like, for example, sometimes you have Iser number one, which is Asur to Bnei Yisrael. And then you add Iser number two, which is Asur even to non-Jews, to Bnei Noach. And now we have to analyze whether or not Gid Anosha is Asur to Bnei Noach. Because if we come to the conclusion, as the Mitzvah will analyze tomorrow, that Gid Anosha is Asur even to Ben Noach, then we have a case of an Iser Mosif, and that's the Chiddush of our Mishnah, that even though it's Mukdoshim, and the Iser Mukdoshim emerges before the Iser Gid Anosha, even when there's no Gid Anosha, there's limbs without sinews, then I would still say, the Mishnah teaches, that Gid Anosha will be Chal on top of Mukdoshim, because Gid Anosha is an Iser Mosif that adds a new element into the equation, expanding the scope of the Iser Gid Anosha to include even non-Jews. And that's, B'li Neder, what we'll talk about tomorrow.